In this video, I will be rebalancing every red tool in Silksong in hopes of making each one viable to use throughout the entirety of your playthrough. A link to the other episodes can be found down below. Before we begin, I want to take a quick moment to fill you in on two important decisions I'm making for this video. First of all, I'm going to be standardizing the red tool capacity values to fit within 4 distinct categories. Consumable having 6 capacity at max pouch upgrades, limited having 10 capacity, standard having 15, and plentiful having 20. Now, why would this be useful? Well, for one, it allows the player to more easily remember how many charges he has to make use of while in the heat of battle. Instead of having to remember that Curvesickle has 16 charges, Delver's Drill has 18, and Longpin has 20, he'll now only have 4 values to keep track of, excluding 2 particular exceptions, which I'll get to later. Moreover, it should allow you, the viewer, to more easily determine whether or not you find my changes reasonable. To demonstrate why, consider whether 9 damage at 16 charges is better or worse than 8 damage at 18 charges. The answer is, it's neither. They both equal 144, but you would have known that instantly had I not given them such annoyingly similar, yet still disparate damage and capacity values. Secondly, I'm going to be using a measurement of maximum potential damage to determine the rough power level of each tool. This MPD value can be found by multiplying a tool's highest possible damage per projectile by its capacity. For example, if a tool can deal up to 10 damage with one projectile and has 10 capacity, its MPD would be 100. If I then had to rebalance a tool that had a capacity of, say, 5, I would have to give it a higher damage value to compensate. In this case, all else equal, that would have to be 20, since 20 times 5 equals 100, matching our baseline MPD. Now, can you really say that 10 damage over 10 charges is equally as powerful as 20 damage over 5 charges? Let's think about it for a moment. Low capacity and high damage allows you to deal that damage more quickly, but high capacity and low damage enables a more careful approach, so you don't have to waste a single heavy hit on a weak enemy. Now, obviously, MPD is a simplification. Other factors like range and projectile size will be important to consider as well. Finally, anytime a damage value is displayed, it will correspond to the highest value obtainable at release through crafting kit upgrades. With all of that out of the way, I'm Holland, and these are the Silksong tools rebalanced. The straight pin is a great place to start because it's among the best contenders for a totally generic red tool, one we can treat as a solid baseline. I'll bump the damage up by 3, but lower its capacity by 4, placing both values at 20. This gives us a nice clean MPD of 400, 8 points lower than it currently is. Let me repeat that again for the skeptics. I'm nerfing straight pin slightly and then choosing it as the baseline for these changes. Given that straight pin is generally considered one of the weaker tools already, I hope you won't accuse me of just trying to bring down the difficulty of Silksong. That is not my intention. But now, every tool that follows should roughly equal the balance of straight pin by aiming for a maximum potential damage value of around 400, other factors being equal. Solution: straight pin capacity decreased from 24 to 20. Damage increased from 17 to 20. Now here's a question. Did you know that Threefold Pin penalizes you for not using it against multiple enemies? That's right, if 2 pins hit the same target, the second pin will only deal half damage. And if the third one hits, it'll only deal 30% damage. I can see the argument for wanting to encourage using the tool against multiple enemies, although you're not encouraged to do so, because how would you know about this hidden penalty? But anyway, for a hidden penalty, a 70% damage reduction is pretty rough. I'd say everything else roughly checks out, it's just this heavy penalty I want to alleviate slightly. Solution: consecutive hits against the same enemy now always deal 50% damage, up from 50% and then 30%. It's almost too embarrassing to admit, but it took me multiple months before I realized that the Slingshot is a direct reference to one of Hornet's attacks from the first game. At the time of recording this video, Slingshot is usually ranked as one of the best tools in the entire game. Though it will occasionally go off at the wrong time and deal almost no damage, when it does work, it hits very hard. Probably too hard even despite the risk. Solution: Slingshot capacity decreased from 12 to 10. Damage decreased from 105 to 70. The MPD remains higher than average because of the limited range and the maximum damage not being guaranteed. Tacks is another top tier tool, and this time not just for the government. What it lacks in countering flying enemies, it makes up for in ease of use, consistency and high damage. That makes the tool eligible for a nerf. Solution: Tacks damage decreased from 56 to 40. I may be the only person on this entire planet who actually likes Longpin, and even I have to admit, it's pretty bad. Yes, it can pierce enemies, but man if it doesn't hit like a wet sponge. I'll give it a slightly higher MPD than average because I don't think the piercing entirely makes up for the pitiful range and awkward trajectory. Solution: Longpin damage increased from 17 to 24. Next up is the Curveclaw and its big brother, the Curvesickle. If you watched the last episode, you'll know that I'm not a big fan of upgradable tools. The base version either becomes too weak or the upgraded version too strong. But since I'm not currently in the business of removing tools from the game, I'll have to settle for lowering the discrepancy between the Curveclaw and the Curvesickle. In regard to the specific attributes of these tools, they have lower range than Straight Pin, but can pierce enemies and have the potential to hit the same target twice. Solution: Curveclaw capacity decreased from 16 to 15. Damage increased from 10 to 16. And for the upgraded version, the Curvesickle? Solution: Curvesickle capacity decreased from 16 to 15. Damage increased from 17 to 18. It is a tragedy that the throwing rings deal as little damage as they do, because they really are a cool item thematically. I think the bouncing element tends to be overlooked as nothing but a gimmick, but it does actually seek out enemies quite intelligently, despite that not making much logical sense. The special challenge animation is probably my favorite thing in this entire game, but it doesn't increase the damage of your next throwing ring nearly enough to make it feel worth using in combat. Solution: Throwing ring damage increased from 14 to 18. Challenge increases the damage of the next ring by 100%, up from 50%. Next up, Pimpillo. I love this tool, however, because it is somewhat tricky to land a direct hit, I do think it could use a slight increase in power. Solution: Pimpillo capacity increased from 8 to 10. Damage increased from 51 to 55. Conchcutter deals low damage per hit, but easily gets multiple hits per cast. It might be a little too strong at the moment. Solution: Conchcutter capacity decreased from 16 to 15. Maximum damage decreased from 42 to 35. Hornet wielding a gun is something I didn't quite know I needed, but which I'm glad to have. I'll refer to the three variants as the Daughter Silkshot, the Architect Silkshot, and the Hornet Silkshot. Because each projectile has an additional cost of 1 silk per shot, the MPD of these tools will have to be inflated to compensate. I should be honest and tell you that I'm not quite sure where I stand on Silkshots costing silk. Obviously, it's a cool idea thematically, but is it really more frustrating than fun in practice? I would genuinely love to hear how successful you find this mechanic to be in terms of actual gameplay. For now, I'll leave the cost be just to be safe. Solution: Daughter Silkshot capacity decreased from 30 to 20. Damage increased from 20 to 35. For the 12th Architect Silkshot, each of the 3 projectiles fired apparently deals a different amount of damage. I'm curious as to why this is the case, because unlike the Threefold Pin, the damage allegedly decreases regardless of whether you're hitting the same enemy or not. I'm open to someone defending why this oddity should exist, but for now, I'd like for each bullet to be equally powerful, simply because I'd rather the player could intuit what his tools actually did. Also, since the Architect Silkshot takes a moment to fire all of its projectiles, it would be nice if it stopped you mid-air like the Hornet variant does. Solution: Architect Silkshot capacity decreased from 24 to 20. Damage changed from 10, 5, and 3 per shot to 15 across the board. Hornet now remains mid-air while firing. The final variant of the Silkshot is the one Hornet makes herself. This one has a brief wind-up animation but can hit multiple enemies at once. Solution: Hornet Silkshot capacity increased from 16 to 20. Damage increased from 34 to 35. Considering how safe most red tools are to use, I always feel like I'm putting myself in unnecessary danger when picking the Delver's Drill. It does at least partly make up for the risk by dealing solid damage, but due to the effort it takes to use, I struggle to view it as the unstoppable powerhouse I've heard some claim it to be. Also, the tool effectively gives you a new pogo, which is pretty neat, but the circumstances under which you're penalized for using it are rather inconsistent. You don't lose a charge from pogoing specific objects, you do lose a charge from pogoing the floor and for pogoing the bell beast, and some objects which are normally pogoable are simply ignored by the drill. As such, I'd like to make it so that no charges are consumed unless the drill deals damage. That way we can ensure consistency while not putting the tool at risk of being abused. Solution: Delver's Drill capacity increased from 18 to 20. Damage increased from 98 to 110. A charge is now only consumed when damage is dealt. I think the Cogwork Wheel looks a lot more menacing than it actually is. Sometimes it'll only hit once or twice or even miss its target entirely, and against flying targets it is practically worthless. To the degree that this tool is praised, I think that praise is largely undeserved. Solution: Cogwork Wheel capacity increased from 10 to 15. Damage increased from 7 to 8. Newsflash, after recording that previous section, my YouTube channel was hacked. I've since regained access, thank goodness, but if you want to know what happened, I'll link a video down below. Moving on. Now for perhaps the most iconic red tool, the fan favorite Cogfly. Given how safely and consistently this tool is able to dish out damage, as well as the fact that it can target airborne enemies, I think it deserves an MPD somewhat lower than Tacks. Moreover, I'm going to make an exception for the capacity of this tool just because 8 fits it so well, allowing for 2 full squads of 4 Cogflies. Solution: Cogfly damage decreased from 50 to 45. One last capacity exception must be made for Rosary Cannon. That's because the 80 rosaries it can fit translate to the number of rosaries it takes to string up a necklace at the machine that used to hold this contraption. In regard to changes I do want to make, there are actually 4. 1. The damage of each projectile currently randomizes between 3 and 7. I'd like to make that a consistent number. 2. The cannon is notoriously expensive to use. In order to reduce grinding, I'd like for a significantly higher percentage of rosaries fired to drop as collectibles. 3. Having to reload the cannon manually is cool the first few times, but it makes me not want to use the tool. I'd change the cannon to reload automatically when sitting on a bench, just like every other red tool. And 4. When you die and lose all your rosaries, you can't reload the weapon for your next encounter. Again, this discourages using the tool, and I'd like to make it so the cannon snags however many rosaries it needs from your supply right before you die to then refuel itself immediately. Solution: Rosary Cannon damage changed from choosing between 3 and 7 to always be 6. Additionally, a larger proportion of shots fired now drop as collectibles. And finally, the cannon is now reloaded automatically as well as upon death. Because of how inconvenient the Rosary Cannon is to use, it ends up receiving a higher MPD than average. The Voltvessels come in 2 forms. I'll tackle the spear first. Not only is this a pretty unique tool mechanically, but there's just something about being able to change its direction by hitting it with your needle that feels so fun and interactive. In terms of raw power, the spear's got high damage and piercing, which I do think makes it a little too strong. Solution: Volt Spear damage decreased from 77 to 65. Compared to its spear variant, the Voltvessel bola seems far less popular. If I were to give an educated guess as to why, I think it's mostly a consequence of how rare it is to actually land both projectiles at once, and how relatively common it is for neither to connect. Like most anything else that bounces in this game, you can try to be smart about predicting where these are gonna go, but usually that's just a waste of your energy. As to how you'd make this tool more skill-based and less random, you might consider leaning into the concept of them being bolas. Bolas aren't supposed to just break apart like these do. They're meant to wrap around the legs of their target, sticking to them, which is sort of the opposite of what happens currently. Solution: Volt bola damage decreased from 90 to 80. On a direct hit against an enemy, bolas now trigger immediately instead of splitting apart. Flintslate increases the damage of your needle swings and needle strikes by 50% for 8 seconds. That's 50% regardless of how many crafting kits you've collected. While the effect is active, you also have a random chance to catch an enemy on fire, dealing additional damage. Oh, good old RNG. I love this tool for its simple but creative design, and although I want to make 3 changes, they should be thought of as quality of life, not buffs. Solution: Flintslate duration increased from 8 to 12 seconds, but every successful needle hit now lowers this timer by 0.5 seconds. Every third hit sets the target ablaze instead of every 2 to 5 hits. And finally, crafting kits now affect the damage increase applied to your needle, maxing out at 50%. Note again how these changes are not meant to act as buffs, and if you really think I accidentally made the tool stronger, then I suggest reducing the duration. The increased duration but decay per hit is meant to make the tool less stressful to use. In practice, it shouldn't change much for the experienced player, but give the beginner a better chance of actually landing a few hits before the timer expires. As for the other changes, they're meant to reduce randomness as well as give you a reason to actually purchase crafting kits when using Flintslate. You might not have access to Snare Setter for very long, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be properly balanced. Also, since the Snare Setter gives you a new pogo, I think it should be treated as I elected to treat Delver's Drill. Solution: Snare Setter damage increased from 109 to 120 on a direct hit and 85 to 100 otherwise. A charge is now only consumed when damage is dealt. Flea Brew increases your movement speed by 34 to 36% based on whether or not you're sprinting, and your attack speed by 50%. My changes will be similar to those proposed for Flintslate. Solution: Flea Brew now also applies to needle strikes, and its duration is increased from 10 to 14 seconds, but every successful needle hit lowers this timer by 0.5 seconds. Movement speed increase standardized to 35%. And finally, crafting kits now affect the attack speed increase, maxing out at 50%. The Plasmium Phial allows you to grant yourself up to 6 lifeblood masks. I wish only to make 2 changes. 1. Crafting kits should slightly reduce the activation time of the Plasmium Phial, once again because they currently have no effect. If you don't like the idea of making the tool activate faster, simply increase the base activation time to compensate. And 2. Being interrupted while using the tool should not cause you to waste a charge. Solution: The crafting kits now slightly reduce the activation time of the Plasmium Phial, and a charge is now only consumed when the tool is used successfully. And with that, I've covered every red tool in the release version of Silksong. If you'd like to see me rebalance the tools from Sea of Sorrow once the expansion drops, be sure to hit that subscribe button down below to let me know. I'm Holland, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.